Herring, and this is my presentation on Russia's political economy and society for Professor Pang's class. Ever since the beginning of the modern Russian state, there have unsurprisingly been problems in the motherland for the economy. Russia kept its feudal system until 1861, but even after that was abolished, great inequality remained. This inequality fueled the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution, and during its subsequent consolidation, communism was put in place, which also lacked liberal economic principles. And so the question facing Russia as it transitioned from the Soviet era was, how does it move to a capitalist liberal system in a society that has really never had private property? Because you went from peasants to state-owned businesses, and so unsurprisingly, there was a great deal of ambiguity in what would come next. However, following the example of Poland, Russia opts for shock therapy, the process of rapidly deconstructing central planning and freeing up prices. And the idea behind this is that the free market would fill in the gap and the country would smoothly transition to a capitalist economy. However, the unfortunate result was this hyperinflation, comparable to that of Weimar Germany, which unsurprisingly was not good for the vast majority of everyday Russians. Nonetheless, Russia remained steadfast and began to roll out a share program where the population could purchase shares in formerly state-owned companies. However, many businesses were in practice not actually sold openly to the public, but to a select few individuals, which resulted in what was called insider privatization, the process by which the old elite were able to acquire the majority of shares in newly privatized firms. And these old elite, along with a small number of new businessmen, took advantage of the newly freed economy and gained enormous wealth. These men became what we would think of as the Russian oligarchs, and they often had close ties with the Yeltsin administration and were also quite prominent in the media. This problem of oligarchs was further compounded when the loans for share program was initiated by a fearful Yeltsin government that was strapped for cash. The program offered shares in lucrative state-owned businesses that had been held back from privatization, particularly in the profitable natural resources sector, which, considering Russia is one of the most resource-rich countries in the world, there was great wealth to be gained from this. As a result, this already close and oftentimes corrupt relationship became even more corrupt. And the one man to solve it was none other than Vladimir Putin himself. Putin begins to dismantle the power of these oligarchs, centralizing power in himself. A great example of this is Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who made his fortune in the computer importing business. And later, through the loans for shares program, he gets into natural resources. He begins opposing Putin politically and is subsequently, surprisingly, found guilty of tax fraud in 2003. He was not released till 2013 and was subsequently exiled, with many of his assets seized by the government. But the cowing of the oligarchs has been extremely popular, unsurprisingly. However, many businesses are now held by Siloviki, which function in much the same way. These Siloviki are new elite, often with extremely close ties to Putin. A great example of this would be Putin's former judo partner, pictured right here, who is now a multimillionaire thanks to his ties to the man himself. Nonetheless, the GDP per capita grew, and a new middle class emerged, endearing Putin to the people. So as you could see in this breakdown of the Russian economy, services make up 63%, industry and agriculture, primarily centered around those so profitable natural resources, constitute a little over a third of the economy. But all in all, opportunities open up to new people, and that has been extremely popular. However, this situation is fragile, as there is still massive inequality, and limited opportunities has caused a sizable portion of the middle class, around 4 to 5 million, to leave the country. And these people are often skilled, educated workers, the exact kind of people Russia needs if it wants to continue this growth. But it's unsurprising considering you have oligarchs living in absurdly palatial residences, while a significant portion of the Russian populace still lives in Soviet-era buildings. Compounding this problem is Russia's substantial resource curse, where the sheer profitability of Russia's plentiful resources stifle other industries' development. And this is particularly troubling with Russia's penchant for getting sanctioned, as unsurprisingly, it is harder to export your resources when you're getting international sanctions every couple of years. And so this has resulted in a significant portion of the Russian population saying the economy is getting worse, though that was certainly not helped by the fact that this was held during the height of the pandemic. You could see something similar over in 2009, where the famous 2008 crash unsurprisingly affected people's opinions on the economy. But during the Putin era, there has been, for the first time, if only slightly, a portion of the populace who thinks the economy is getting better. But as far as where the economy goes from here, we really don't know, because Russia, like it is said often, is an enigma, and the sheer unpredictability of Russia's political actions and the ramifications those have in the economy will just have to wait to be seen. Transitioning over to society, though, Russia is absolutely vast, and unsurprisingly, it has swallowed up many smaller ethnic groups. Today, like in the Soviet Union, they form smaller republics, which have equal representation in theory, but in practice, Russian culture, as opposed to Chuvash or Tartar, really dominates the cultural landscape. And this is because Russian culture creates a super majority. There is just simply no competing. However, these minorities are oftentimes in concentrated areas, and so while they are individually small, in their areas they can be quite important. Religion has also historically been quite homogeneous, dominated by Orthodox Christianity, a major Christian branch that broke with Roman Catholicism. However, it endured harsh persecution under the atheistic Soviet regime, and while the Orthodox Church has enjoyed a favored status once more, many Russians are still atheist. There is also a significant Muslim minority, particularly in the Caucasus regions. And so, as you can see here is Putin. Here is Patriarch Kirill, a very important man in the Russian Orthodox Church, a Muslim leader, and then these guys right here are what are called old believers, which if you ever want to spend an afternoon going down a rabbit hole, the difference between the old believers as opposed to the Russian Orthodox Church is a fascinating thing to study. So as you can see here, most are unspecified or atheist. However, Russian Orthodoxy is growing, and there is an important Muslim minority. And so while Russia is ethnically and religiously homogenous, what minorities do exist have at times argued for greater independence and autonomy. One such hot region is that aforementioned Caucasus region, which has a substantial Muslim minority that just so happens to overlap with an ethnic minority called the Chechens. After the fall of the Soviet Union, the Chechens wanted to break away, and so they began agitating for a separate republic, resulting in the First and Second Chechen Wars. After the end of these wars, a de facto Chechen state was established with the help of Putin, and that is currently ran by Ramzan Kadyrov. And so as you could see, this first Chechen War photo, which happened just after the fall of the Soviet Union, beautifully illustrated by this massive red star on the Russian military equipment. And then you have the Second Chechen War, which happened in the early 2000s with slightly more modern equipment. Political and ideological culture, though, have also maintained great homogeny due to the ideological stranglehold of communism during the Soviet Union. And unsurprisingly, Russia is un-Western and illiberal, both politically and, as we've already discussed, economically. Social trust levels are low, and many Russians say they would never attend a peaceful protest, according to the World Values Survey, which is a mainstay of liberal political government. In fact, the only ideology that seems to have gripped the people is a reactionary nationalism that insists Russia is fundamentally different and thus not subject to the liberal dictates of the West. And that by combining this ideology with a strong authoritarian rule, they could restore greater Russia. And this shows itself in the resurgence of the Russian Orthodox Church, which, thanks to Patriarch Kirill, has extremely close ties to the Kremlin, and in Russia's rejection of Western movements such as gay rights. But as with the economy, where things go socially remains to be seen. Russia is an enigma, as I've already said, and so the effects of the current war, greater economic insecurity, and various ethnic minorities can all play a part in Russia's future. And so where we go from here socially and economically remains to be seen. Nonetheless, I would like to thank my primary source, O'Neill, Cases in Comparative Politics. Obviously, I cited the Russia subsection, focusing on political economy and society. And if you would have any questions, pin them down in the comments below. I will answer them. And I hope you guys have a great rest of your day.